Okay. Well, let me just mute people. Thank you. Okay. Today we're talking about making coffee on Shabbos. I'm gonna talk about what it takes, primarily about the questions of bishul relating to making coffee on Shabbos. There are about 5 other things that I'm not going to talk about at this time. At the end, I'll just quickly run through them that we're not going to talk about. I'm going to really focus on the bishul parts of it like this. Okay, and to help understand that, let's just start like this. There's when you make coffee. Hold on a second. Someone's trying to call me. Sorry about that. When you make coffee beans, in their original, they come green. Okay, and this picture that you see in front of you is different stages of what it takes to roast coffee beans. And hold on, let me put this on like this. Okay, and the different numbers that are on there reflect different amounts of roasting it. So the first one, number 1, is a raw green coffee bean. Literally, they're called green beans. That's what they call them, green beans. And then as you roast it more and more, it develops the brownish color that we think of when we think of coffee. And depending on how you do it for, or how you do it, will depend on what you get. So number 10 on there, which is about, I think, like 11, 12 minutes of roasting, gets you what's called the city roast, or what you might see in your house as a mild coffee. And the number 12 is a full city roast, or medium coffee. And the next one is a French roast, is a medium dark coffee. And then the last one is the full French roast, which is a dark coffee. Okay, and then Starbucks they guess is in the middle. They're like number 12 or 13. Okay, so there's different ways to roast the beans, and depending on how you on how much you roast, will tell you. Excuse me. Hold on a second. I'm trying to figure out what I'm doing here. How to unshare. I don't know how to do that. Okay, so for now we'll just live with that. So we'll decide. Oh, here it is, right here. Stop sharing. We'll decide how much the type of coffee you're going to get. Okay, but all coffee, no matter what you're going to do, you're going to end up. You have to roast those beans first. Okay. Then after you roast the beans, you grind them up. Those ground up beans can then be brewed. And brewing means you take this ground up beans and you put it in contact with boiling hot water in the area of like 200-degree kind of water. It sits with that water for a certain amount of time, where it slowly drips through the ground beans for however much time, and to draw out all the flavor out of those beans. And now we have a cup of coffee. Okay, now we have a cup of coffee. Okay, if you want to make what's called espresso, so espresso is the same idea, but instead of dripping it through slowly, you use pressure in order to push it through less amount of water in less amount of time, and to make a concentrated version of a coffee. But the same idea is you're trying to get the flavor out. Once we've roasted the beans and the flavor is now developed, we're going to draw it out with boiling hot water. So, excuse me, if you brew coffee at home, you make freshly brewed coffee, then that's what you do. You take either whole beans and you grind them at home, or you buy already ground coffee. But it's called fresh coffee, but it's really not fresh. It's really roasted already. And then you pour the hot water through them. Okay, in one way or another. Okay, so that if you were to do that on Shabbos, if you were to brew the coffee by yourself on Shabbos, I mean, you took the roasted beans and you boiled them. What is that? That's bishul achar afiyah. It had a fiyah to it, and now you went ahead and went a step further, and you did bishul to it. So the Mechaber brings 2 days, whether that's mutter or not. Are you allowed to do bishul achar afiyah or not? And Ravad Yosef says that the Iker Shita that the Mechaber holds like is to be mekel, and therefore he says Sfardim could brew themselves a cup of coffee on Shabbos. No problem, they're allowed to do that. Okay, there's no bishul achar afiyah for him, and therefore perfect. They can make their coffee. Okay, the Ramah says that we're machmir to be choshesh that you're not allowed to do bishul achar afiyah. So the Mishabur says, and therefore he says this example: you're not allowed to make yourself brew a cup of coffee on Shabbos if you're an Ashkenazi, because it's bishul achar afiyah. Okay, it already had a fiyah. We're doing bishul. You're not allowed to do that. Okay, so that's for us a simple case, and really for Sfardim, basically they're off the hook. They could go home. They don't have to listen to the rest of what I'm going to say, or a lot of what I'm going to say, because it's not going to be so relevant to them. But for Ashkenazim, we're starting off with a problem of doing bishul achar afiyah, and therefore now to do it. Okay, Fine. That's pretty straightforward. People who don't want to do the brewing at home, okay, they don't have the time or whatever it is, they don't want to brew at home, they buy instant coffee, okay? And the short version of what instant coffee is the company brews up a huge pot of coffee, okay, and a whole tank full of it, they do exactly what I just described in a very large scale, and then they remove the water from it. And once they take the water out of it, now the person at home has a powder, and that powder can put it back into water, and it turns right back into a cup of coffee. Okay, so it looks similar a little bit to the original ground coffee, to fresh ground coffee, but it's not. This is already cooked. Okay, and there's two ways to do this, and I'm gonna explain those two ways to do that, and we're gonna see l'chayra, a nafkamina between these two ways, l'inyan hilchos Shabbos, between these two ways of drying coffee. The two ways are we could either freeze dry the coffee or we could spray dry the coffee. Okay, and if you're familiar, you'll bear with me for a minute. What that means is the freeze dried coffee means you take the coffee, you pour it out, lay it out on sheets, just like sheet pans. Just lay it out you pour it out there. You freeze it solid, and then you put it into a machine where it under very controlled conditions, with very controlled temperatures and very high amount of vacuum, you turn it from being a solid, meaning it's ice, you turn it from being a solid into being a gas. You get the water out of there, turn it into a gas, like as if you're boiling a pot of spaghetti, but it never turns into a liquid in between. It goes from being solid to being gas without ever being liquid in between, leaving behind this dried out cup of coffee. Okay, you poured a sheet of coffee on a tray, and then you froze it solid. So we have a frozen coffee, and when we finish the process, we've removed all the water from that, leaving just what they call the solids behind. And so we have this cup of all the solid parts of it, and it can come back to being a cup of coffee, but just by putting it back into boiling water. Okay, it's a very complicated process. It takes about 24 hours to do it. But it makes a great cup of coffee because it retains a lot of the original flavor. And it's very easy to make it turn back into coffee and water, etc. So it's a fancy, expensive process, and it makes what's called freeze-dried coffee. The other method is called to spray dry, and that is you take the brewed coffee. Okay, they have this huge vat or tank full of brewed coffee. You spray it in a very fine mist into this big container, big chamber that's at a very high temperature, and the water just boils out of it just quickly. Imagine like if you took the pot on your stovetop and you boiled it for a long time, you boil the water out of it. So in the spray jar, it does the same thing, but it just does it instantly. It's such a tiny droplets of water that it boils out in seconds. The whole thing it boils out and comes out the bottom of powder. Okay, you could. I'm going to share my screen again. You can tell the difference between those. And I mention it because, how do I get to the next screen? I don't know how to do that. Sorry, guys. Oh, here we go. You can see the difference between them. On the left is you see the freeze-dried coffee, and on the right would be spray-dried. Had we been doing this in person, I would have shown you for real. But you can see that the freeze-dried ones are chunks. They come out as chunks, and as opposed to the spray-dried one comes out as a powder. So sometimes the spray-dried ones, they'll try to clump the liquids together. It's called agglomeration to get them to be a little bit more chunky, but they'll never be chunky like the freeze-dried ones. And if you touch the spray-dried one, they fall apart back into powder in a second. So that you could tell the difference which one you got. But it also has a nafkamina for Pesach, which I'm mentioning, not really our subject today, but I mention it and that is that if you when you freeze dry it, all you do is you put in coffee. That's all it is. It's just coffee, and therefore the freeze-dried coffee is okay for Pesach. Of course, unless it has a flavor or if it's decaf, but just regular freeze-dried coffee is fine for Pesach no matter what. As opposed to the spray-dried one is they sometimes put starch into it to help with the drying process, and therefore it needs hashgacha because the powder that's in there, the starch that's in there might be something that's chametz or kidneys. So therefore, for Pesach, we tell people that you need to have if your coffee is spray dried, it needs hashgacha for Pesach just because of those starches that come in there. And here in this little video that you're watching, I'm showing you the difference, how you can see the difference between one and the other, between the spray dried and the freeze dried. It's really easy to tell the difference. If you touch it in a second, you'll know the difference. Okay, so so those are our two processes. Okay, and now we're going to get to a nafkamina between them. Okay, and that'll help us first go through what a shaila is for making instant coffee. Okay, so now I already said to you, both this instant coffee, either type, had afia to when you first roasted the beans, and it had bishul to it also. And so now the question is like this: the question we have to think about is that now that we did bishul, are we allowed to put it into water and boil it again? What's the shaila? The question is like this: we have two rules that apply over here. We have one rule is in bishul acha bishul b'davar yavish. When we have a dry item, there's no bishul acha bishul. So on the one hand, this is a dry product. We're looking at something that's dry over here. So on the one hand, we should say there's no bishul acha bishul if something that's dry. On the other hand, we have a rule that yesh bishul acha bishul b'davar lach. Okay, so the question is this a davar yavish or davar lach? How should we treat this thing? And depending on that is whether we'll be allowed to cook it on Shabbos or not cook it on Shabbos. Okay, so and there are going to be two shaylas. Both are a machlokes, seemingly between Rav Moshe and Rav Shlomo Zalman. And for both of them, I'm going to need to give you a drop of background. Okay, the first one is like this. The Mechaber says like this. The Mechaber talks about a case called, I hope I pronounce this correctly, in panda. Okay, and what's in panda? It's animal fat wrapped in a dough. So there's a sort of a knish that instead of potatoes on the inside, it has fat on the inside of it. And the Magen Avraham says, the way he reads Mechaber, the Magen Avraham says you're allowed to heat that up on Shabbos. You're allowed to heat it up, meaning above Yad Saledis on Shabbos. And he says, why am I allowed to do that? He says, because the fat was already cooked. In panda is not raw, it was already cooked before Shabbos, so it's already been cooked. So we say it's aim bishul acha b'shivat av yavish. The fat is a solid. If you remember, animal fat is solid at room temperature. So at room temp, the animal fat, the animal fat is a solid, and since it's a solid, aim bishul acha b'shivat av yavish. So the Magen Avraham says he thinks the Shulchan Aruch says that it's a question. He says you're allowed to heat it up because we decide now what's going to happen is when you heat it up, the fat is going to turn into a liquid. So that's going to be a davar lach. He says, but no, right now we're dealing with what we have in front of us is a davar yavish, and therefore there's aim bishul acha bishul davar yavish. So that's what the Magen Avraham says. So Rav Moshe says, well, the same thing is butter. He says butter. If I have butter is pre-cooked on Shabbos. It's cooked before Shabbos. Butter is solid, but it's cooked first as milk. The milk is pasteurized, and now I have butter, which is a solid. So Rav Moshe says you can heat up butter in a way that it becomes yad saledis, even though it will turn into a liquid. Although it will be a liquid by the end of the story, but the beginning of the story you're starting with a salad, and since you're starting with a salad, so that's okay. It's a davar yavish, just like the Magen Avraham's case of the fat inside in panda, or however you pronounce it, and therefore Ramesh says you're allowed to do that. But Rav Shlomo Zalman says no, it's not true. The cases are not the same. Okay, and there's a difference between fat and butter, having to do with the way you make them, and having to do with why this bishul acha bishul b'davar lach. He says like this: by a salad, what decides whether it's cooked or not, it's just physical. If you cooked it or you didn't cook it, if you cook it enough, it becomes cooked. Once it's cooked, it's done. It'll stay cooked for good. As opposed to a liquid, we say liquid is only considered to be cooked while it's hot. The main feature of being cooked means that it's now it's hot, and once it cools down, it undoes that. That's why we hold yesh bishul acha bishul b'davar lach. So he says, so if you want to decide whether food is a liquid or a solid, we have to look at, and it was cooked as a liquid, and now it's solidified. We have to look at what was it when it turned into a solid. So he says, when the animal fat turns into a solid, it turns into a solid while it's still hot. So it was mavushal, it was cooked, and then as it slowly cools down and it begins to congeal. So when it does that, it's still hot at the time when it becomes a solid. So it was mavushal. That whole time it was considered mavushal. Then it became a solid. Well, once it's a solid, the rule is things that are solid can't get cooked again. Ein bishlach habishal for the solid. So it went from being cooked to being cooked, and now ein bishlach habishal. That's why the Magen Avraham says you're allowed to do that. However, in the case of the butter, that's not what happens. In the case of the butter, you cook it as a liquid. Then it cools down. When it cools down, it becomes unmavushal. It loses its bishul when it cools down. When the milk cooled down, then you turn it into butter. So now you have something that was not mavushal, and the not mavushal thing turned solid. Okay, not mavushal thing that became solid. You could be vashal it again. The fact that it's solid now doesn't make a difference. It was not mavushal before it became a solid. Okay, so now that's what Shlomo Zalman says. So seemingly, this same question about butter should apply to the freeze-dried coffee also. Because in the freeze-dried coffee, what happens is we brew it, we cook it up as a liquid, we turn it into brew a cup of coffee, but then what we do is before it becomes a solid, before it becomes a solid, it cools down completely. The coffee goes from being a boiled up pot of brewed coffee to being it comes into a liquid, and then it becomes into a frozen block of ice, at which point the bishul is over. Before it becomes ice, before it becomes a solid, it became a liquid. And then when it became a liquid, the bishul was finished and over. And the bishul is over, according to Shlomo Zalman, it's not mavushal. If it's not mavushal, the fact that it's a solid now won't help us anything. According to Ramosha, the fact that it is a solid means that you can't do any bishul to it. And that I'm saying that in the freeze dried. The spray dried is not like that. The spray dried is a case where will both agree that there's no problem of bishlach habishal, and that's because in the spray dried it goes from being a hot brewed kettle or tank full of coffee, and it gets spray dried. So it goes from being a liquid that's mavushal to being a solid without ever being a cold liquid in between. Okay, it's exactly like the case of the butter. It goes from being a mavushal liquid to being a mavushal solid without ever being a cold down liquid in the middle. So they would both agree that you're allowed to do that. Now, Ramosha and Shlomo Zalman both, I believe, didn't see freeze-dried coffee. Ramosha, the way he describes the drying that they do, is for sure describing spray drying coffee. That's for sure. What he describes, it's not exactly, we wouldn't make it accurate, but it's for sure he means something that's spray dried. Shlomo Zalman doesn't say what he's talking about, but when Shabbos was printed in the 1970s, I don't even think they had freeze-dried coffee in Eretz Yisrael. So he was for sure talking about. He didn't say what kind he's talking about. They're talking about spray-dried coffee. And so they don't. Neither of them talk about this. Shlomo Zalman doesn't connect this butter thing to us. I'm just connecting it to the freeze-dried, which Shlomo Zalman didn't talk about. But that he has this machlokes of butter that they do have. But the application to coffee is just my thinking. Neither of them said it. Okay, so that's one question about reheating a cup of coffee that might be a nafkamina, whether it's freeze dried or spray dried. The second one is not going to be nafkamina; it's going to be the same child for both of them. Is that Emperor Shlomo Zalman and Ramosha both talk about this thing, and that's like this. The Mechaber and the Ramah both talk about when is there a problem of bishul for heating up salt. Okay, so there's all kinds of dinim about that, about when you're allowed to cook salt, how much bishul it needs, and what it is that makes something to be muvashal. The Mishnah Berurah says that whole discussion about that kind of bishul on salt is talking about salt that you mine from the ground. Okay, you just scrape it out of the ground, so it never had any potential bishul. But if you have salt, or he says, or sugar, which were cooked as part of the production, which is most salt that we have nowadays, it's its own interesting shayla, but that's not for today. But it's cooked as part of the production. So he says, okay, so because the salt is in a solid form in your house, salt or sugar is in a solid form, so he says, that's what he says. But then he says, you should know, some people hold that it's not true, and say that if you put the salt or the sugar into your hot drink, it dissolves right away into a liquid. So it becomes a liquid, and therefore it should be usher to do it on Shabbos in a kli rishon. Okay, in a kli sheni you're allowed to do it. Okay, now who are those others? Who are these ones who say this? So it's a little, if I could use the word fuzzy. He quotes Rabbi Kiva Eiger. His source that he brings is Rabbi Kiva Eiger. It's not so clear that Rabbi Krieger says, and I'll explain to you why. Because the first thing you should think of is like, wait a second, didn't I just tell you that the Magen Avraham says that if the thing is in a solid form, if it's solid now, then you're allowed to turn it into a liquid. You're allowed to heat it up to be Yatzaleh, but even though it turns into a liquid. So what is the Krieger saying that's different than that the Magen Avraham said you're allowed to do it, and why is he saying you're not allowed to do it? So l'chayra, the difference is that it depends on what happens when the food comes in contact with the heat. So in the case of the animal fat, when I put the animal fat into contact with the hot item, then I'm putting a solid there in contact with the hot item. I'm taking this in panda or pananda, whatever you call it, and I put it next to the hot thing. I'm putting something that's solid. So we say, what I did is fine. I did ein bishul acha bishul, but davi yavish. As opposed to if I put the salt into the hot water and it instantly becomes a liquid, so I'm putting a liquid into there. Okay, that would seemingly be the difference between those. Now, but if you look at Rabbi Kiva, he asks this question. He says, "How am I different than the Magen Avraham?" And what he says is not exactly applicable to salt, because he's not talking about salt. He's talking about a person who pours hot water onto animal fat, and the hot water liquefies the animal fat and makes it yatzaleh display. So he says like this. He says the case of the Magen Avraham, because he says the case of the Magen Avraham would be like a person who poured hot water continuously onto the animal fat and turned the. No, I'm sorry, I'm saying that backwards. Okay, he says the case of the Magen Avraham is where the person. Okay, if the person pours hot water, if I pour hot water onto the animal fat, so what I'm doing is I'm pouring hot water onto the animal fat. The first thing that's going to happen is the fat will turn into a liquid. If the fat turns into a liquid, then I'm going to continue pouring hot water onto it, and I'm going to be mavashel it. So I made it into a liquid. Now that it's a liquid, Craig is saying that's what you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to keep pouring hot onto it because you're taking what's already a liquid and turning and heating it up. But the Magen Avram's case is the person put on next to the fire was something that was a solid. He didn't turn it into a liquid first. As he says, it only becomes as mamela that it turns into a liquid. So he says that's the difference. So here, Craig says you're not allowed to pour hot water that keeps on pouring to turn it into a liquid and then keep pouring afterwards when you're going to be heating. You're going to now be mavashel the thing that's in liquid form. Now, if we think about the salt and the sugar, it's sort of in between those two cases. What I'm putting on is a solid. That's like the Magen Avram's case. But it's turning into a liquid instantly, which is a little like Rabbi Kiva. It's sort of in the middle there. So the Mishnah Berurah, who says the salt is like Rabbi Kiva, is assuming that's what he means. It's not so clear that's what it means. That it would for sure be exactly the same case Rabbi Kiva would have been machmer about. Anyhow, so back to our case. In Rosh Hashanah says in Shmir Shabbos, he says that we should be machmer for the shita. The Mishnah Berurah brings it as such a shita, and he says therefore you could only put the instant coffee into a klisheni. In other words, putting the coffee into the hot water, pouring hot water on the coffee, which is turning the solid right into a liquid, is the same thing as pouring hot water onto pouring hot water onto salt or onto animal fat. That you're not allowed to do that because it's considered davalach, since it instantly turns into a davalach when you pour it into it. That's what Rosh Hashanah says. He says you should only put it into a klisheni. You shouldn't pour water from a klivishon onto it. And Ramosha says, no. Ramosha says is the minig is not to be macher for the shita. He says, I personally will only make my instant coffee in a klish lishi, no less, not only klisheni, in a klish lishi. But he says the minig is not to be macher for that shita. That's another machlekes that making that. Okay, let me move to some other things. I'm getting there. Okay, we talked till now about regular plain coffee. And what I said until now applies whether it's regular instant coffee or decaf. It's the same thing. Flavored coffees, you cannot do that because it's not necessarily that the flavors that are in there went through a bishul process to make them into flavors. It's not for sure that they were. Rabbi Price did a went through a very interesting scenario. He went through a whole thing of how a certain item was made, and he decided in that case it was okay, but other flavored ingredients he wasn't convinced. But you could add milk or these milk substitutes as long as they're like refrigerated or shelf stable, because those are all mevushal. Those have to be pasteurized and they're in liquid form, so you can put them into a klisheni. Like if you want to add milk or soy milk or those kind of things, you can't add raw milk, of course, but you could add those kind of other things. And Rabbi Price further, he wrote a whole bunch of articles about using sugar, the artificial sugars like Splenda and Sweet and Low and Equal, and he thought those were all okay also to put into a klisheni. Okay, now another question comes up is the Starbucks Via, or there's a Nescafe they sell in Eretz Yisrael where they put some fresh coffee grinds into the instant coffee. So inherently, let's say in the Nescafe it says it's 97% instant coffee, but it has 3% of fresh coffee put into it. So the question is it an Isser Bishul to cook something that has in it this 3% of the uncooked coffee? It just has just roasted but not cooked. So in that, Rabbi Herbstman showed me a Prima Gadol who talks about this. Two Prima Gadols talks about it, and he says Prima Gadol says, why should it be mutter? What would be the reason to think that it's okay to do this? I mean, this 3% of it was not mavushal. Why should we be allowed to do that? So Prima Gadol says it's because on Shabbos we have a rule meleches machshavos. You only usher to do things based on what the person's kavan is. What is he trying to do? If the thing is 97% mavushal, then that's what he's doing. He's reheating something that was already mavushal with ein bishul bishul. He says, but if the fact that there's a couple of percent, we can ignore that. It's not important. He brings a Beis Yosef who says it's also. The Beis Yosef says. The Beis Yosef says we'll follow the Rav that also. There's a Minchas Kayin who's talking on a Darabanan level. I don't think he's talking about the Raisa. The Minchas Kayin says the Imla can is hatas rech l'shirur. It can't be that you should worry about little bits. So that's a Darabanan dikasara. But why don't we say even if it's not Machas Mashevas, it should be also Darabanan? So they say that it should be okay. Now the cases they're talking about is a person who has meat with a little gravy on top of it. So we say the person, what is he trying to do? He's putting a piece of meat on to warm up. The fact that there's some gravy in there, that's not his kavanah. He doesn't have that in mind, and therefore you should be allowed to do that. If we would say that applied to our case, then we would say is that the same thing. The person has in mind to cook the 97% that's already mavushal, and he's not thinking about the 3%. Okay, and two reasons to disagree with that is the first is because Rav Moshe brings not this specific Prima Gadol, but he brings a bunch of other Prima Gadols who talk about this. He doesn't bring the reason that Prima Gadol says, which is about the Meleches Machshavos. He says, no, this is a big chiddush. He says it's not something that could be samacham, and therefore he says logically it makes no sense that if part of it is mavushal and part of it is not mavushal, then there's an Isser Bishul on the part that's not mavushal. So he says b'shas avcha gadol ula yesh lahatir, but obviously he's not a big believer. That's one reason from a halachic perspective, and the other reason is because if we say that this is a thought, this is connected to a malachas machshavos, it's mutter because I'm not trying to cook that part. Well, doesn't really apply. That logic doesn't apply when we're talking about something where it was put in specifically like that. Okay, Starbucks and this Nescafe brand are specifically putting it in because they think it's going to make a better cup of coffee. Right? They're doing it because it's there because they want that thing to be in there. So we're going to say, I'm not mechavan to have that thing in there. What do you mean I'm not mechavan? Of course I'm mechavan to have the thing in there because I'm trying. I'm trying to cook this thing. So you can't say that I don't have that in mind. Okay. Okay. The last thing I'll just mention quick, just for a second, is that there's one more kind of coffee that I know of, which is liquid coffee concentrate. It's mainly used like by caterers, or if you go to a coffee machine where what they'll have a liquid of a concentrated coffee in it, like in a box, and then when you buy the cup of coffee, or the caterer wants to make it, he's basically just adding hot water to that concentrate that they have. So I assume that in most cases that's made by they brew the coffee just like with heat, like hot water, like everything else. In which case, it's a regular shaila just of what we've been talking about until now, but use those on Shabbos. Because I mentioned, I'm sorry, because you could buy them on a retail level also. You could buy single serve, like little, as if it looks like a little like a K cup. It's not really, but it looks like that. It's the concentrate is in there, and you just usually get mixed with the hot water. So if it's made with through heat, then it's the same questions we were talking about. My impression is there are also those people who do a cold extraction for that. They get the flavor out of the beans just without any heat at all, in which case, of course, you wouldn't be allowed to do that. And you can't even put it into a cliche, and there's a Mishnah Brew about that. You wouldn't be allowed to do anything with that, even though it's like sort of water, but that you wouldn't be allowed to do that. Okay, I'm not going to bother, but there was like 5 things I said at the beginning. I'm not going to tell you about 5 other shilas, not serious shilas, but 5 other type of shilas making instant coffee. And that's it. Speak to you.